Susan balanced the tray of banana on her small head. Her bare feet dragged on the dusty path and her oversized shorts clung to her thin frame. The sun was hot, and her stomach growled with hunger. "Susan, if you come back without selling everything, you'll regret it." Aunt Janet's voice echoed in her mind. Her threats scared her more than the beatings she gave. Susan tried to focus on selling the bananas. "Banana for sale, sweet banana!" she called out. Her voice was weak, and no one stopped. The villagers were too busy to notice her. A woman passed by. Susan looked at her with hope, but she glanced at her and walked away. Her heart sank. Susan thought of her parents. Her father used to carve wood into beautiful shapes. He had been her hero. Susan used to sit by his side in the evenings, watching him carve wood into beautiful shapes. His voice filled with laughter still echoed in her mind. But one fateful day, a fever that refused to stop took him away, leaving Susan and her mother alone. Her mother, oh, her precious mother, worked hard selling beans in the market to ensure she had food to eat and a chance to attend school. Susan remembered her warm embrace, the song she sang to her at night, and the smell of okra that clung to her clothes. But life had been cruel to her too. A year after her father's death, her mother had fallen sick. Susan watched helplessly as she grew weaker and weaker, her once vibrant eyes dimming until they closed forever. Susan didn't cry on the day her mother was buried. She had been too shocked, too broken to shed tears. But now, every tear she hadn't cried then seemed to flow freely. Ever since her parents had died, Aunt Janet had taken her in, not out of love, but out of some twisted sense of obligation. Every day since then, she had hawked bananas from dawn to dusk, dragging her tired little legs across the town. She stopped under a tree to rest. The tray felt heavy, and sweat dripped down her face. She wiped it off with her hand, leaving dirt streaks on her cheeks. The weight of the tray was crushing, but she couldn't stop. "Banana for sale," she tried again, but no one listened. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she kept walking. She had no choice. Aunt Janet would beat her if she failed to sell the bananas. The dusty road stretched ahead, endless and unforgiving. Susan's only choice was to keep moving. The sun was setting by the time Susan sold her first banana. A man on a bicycle stopped and handed her a crumpled note in exchange for 3 fruits. "Thank you, sir," Susan whispered. The man didn't respond, pedaling away without a glance. Susan's legs felt heavy as she walked through the village, calling out again, "Sweet banana for sale!" But the streets were growing quieter, and people were heading home. Her hope faded with the light of day. By the time she sold the last banana, the sky was dark. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The money in her pocket was not enough to please Aunt Janet. She knew she would still find a reason to punish her. As she neared the edge of the village, Susan paused by the cemetery. Her mother's grave was there, marked by a small mound of earth. She didn't plan to stop, knowing Aunt Janet would be furious if she was late. But her heart ached too much to keep walking. Susan knelt by the grave, the cool earth under her hands. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I miss you. I'm trying, but it's so hard." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the dry soil. "Aunt Janet doesn't like me. She beats me. She doesn't feed me. I don't want to stay with her. I want to be with you and Papa." The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It felt like a gentle touch, as if her mother's spirit was comforting her. She closed her eyes, imagining her arms around her, telling her it would be okay. But reality returned quickly. Susan wiped her tears, stood up and picked up the empty tray. "Mama, I'll come back tomorrow," she whispered. "I love you." With a heavy heart, she began the long walk home. Susan's heart raced as she approached Aunt Janet's house. The dim light of the oil lamp inside shone through the tiny cracks in the wooden door. Her small hands trembled as she pushed it open, the creak loud enough to announce her arrival. Aunt Janet was sitting on a wooden stool in the corner of the room, peeling yam. Her sharp eyes immediately fell on Susan. "Where have you been?" she barked, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. I sold all the banana, Auntie," Susan stammered, holding out the crumpled notes she had earned. Her legs felt weak beneath her. Her face felt light when Bridget wrapped a cold arm around her shoulders and pulled her toward the door. She snatched the money from her hand and counted it quickly, her lips pursed. "You call this money?" she hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think I sent you out just to crawl back here late with this small change?" I sold everything, Auntie. The money is complete," Susan whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't know what else to say. She had done her best, but her best was never enough for her. Before she could react, Aunt Janet grabbed the cane resting beside her stool and stood up. The fear in Susan's eyes was immediate, and she slowly stepped back, but the small room gave her no space to escape. "You lazy, useless girl!" she shouted, swinging the cane down on her. The first strike landed on her back, sharp and painful. She cried out, but Aunt Janet didn't stop. Again and again, the cane met her fragile body, each blow pushing her closer to the edge of her strength. By the time she stopped, Susan was on the floor, curled up in a ball, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. Aunt Janet threw the cane aside and spat on the ground, her face twisted in anger. "Now go to bed," she snapped, "and don't even think about eating anything tonight, useless child." Susan didn't argue. She had learned long ago that protesting would only make things worse. Slowly, she picked herself up and limped to the corner of the living room where she usually slept. There was no mattress, no blanket, just the cold, hard floor. She lay down, her thin arms wrapped around her aching stomach, and closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain. But sleep wouldn't come. Her body hurt too much, and her hunger gnawed at her like a persistent ache that wouldn't go away. The house was silent now, except for the occasional creak of wood as the wind blew outside. She could hear Aunt Janet snoring faintly from her room, a sound that filled her with a mixture of relief and resentment. As the night dragged on, Susan's hunger became unbearable. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a proper meal. Her mind wandered to the kind neighbor who lived a few houses away, an elderly woman named Mama Ona. She had always been kind to her, sometimes giving her small pieces of bread or roasted corn when Aunt Janet wasn't looking. The thought of food was too tempting. She sat up quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. What if Aunt Janet woke up? What if she caught her sneaking out? The thought alone sent a shiver down her spine, but her hunger was stronger than her fear. Carefully, Susan got to her feet and tiptoed to the door. She held her breath, her eyes darting nervously toward Aunt Janet's room. When she reached the door, she pushed it open slowly, just enough to slip through. The cool night air hit her face, a brief relief from the stifling heat of the house. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her bare feet slapping against the dirt road. She didn't stop until she reached Mama Ona's house. Standing in front of her door, she hesitated. What if she was angry at her for coming so late? What if she didn't want to help her? But her hunger pushed her forward. She raised a trembling hand and knocked softly on the wooden door. It took a moment, but soon she heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and Mama Ona's kind, weathered face appeared in the dim light of her lantern. "Susan, what are you doing here at this time of the night?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I'm sorry, Mama Ona," Susan whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten all day." Her expression softened immediately. "Oh, my poor child, come inside," she said, opening the door wider. Susan stepped into her small, cozy room. Her stomach growled loudly and she looked down, embarrassed. Mama Ona noticed and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sit down, Susan. Let me get you something to eat," she said softly. Susan sat on a small wooden stool near the table, her eyes following Mama Ona's every move as she uncovered a pot and scooped out a piece of yam. She added a little stew and placed the plate in front of her. "Eat, my child," she said, her voice tender. Susan didn't need to be told twice. She picked up the food with her trembling hands and began eating, tears streaming down her face as the delicious meal filled her empty stomach. It wasn't just the food. It was the kindness, the feeling of being cared for, even if only for a moment. Mama Ona watched her quietly, her eyes filled with sadness. She had seen how Aunt Janet treated the girl, but she felt powerless to intervene. Still, she did what little she could to make her life a bit easier. When Susan finished eating, she looked up at Mama Ona, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Thank you, Mama Ona," she whispered. "Thank you, so much." Mama Ona smiled gently and placed a hand on her head. "You're always welcome here, Susan. You're a good girl, and God sees your struggles. He will make a way for you, my child." Her words brought a small measure of comfort to Susan's aching heart. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope, however faint. But she knew she couldn't stay. If Aunt Janet woke up and found her missing, the punishment would be even worse. Reluctantly, she stood up. "I have to go now," she said, her voice filled with regret. "Thank you again, Mama Ona." Mama Ona nodded, her eyes heavy with concern, but as she climbed onto the horse, she forced herself to breathe. "Be careful, Susan, and remember, you can always come to me if you need anything." Susan nodded and stepped out into the night, her stomach full but her heart still heavy. The road back home felt even longer, the weight of her life pressing down on her like never before. As she approached the house, she paused, staring at the faint light coming from the window. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this life, but for now, she had no choice. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside, the cold floor greeting her like an old enemy. And so Susan lay down once again, her body sore, her heart heavy, but her stomach finally full. As sleep began to claim her, her mind wandered to her parents, to the love and warmth she once knew. Would she ever feel that way again? She didn't know. But for now, all she could do was survive. Susan woke up the next morning to the familiar sound of Aunt Janet shouting her name. Her body ached from the beating she received the night before, but she forced herself to get up. She knew better than to keep her waiting. "Susan, you better come out here now, lazy girl," Aunt Janet yelled. Susan staggered in, rubbing her tired eyes. Aunt Janet stood there with a tray of oranges, her face stern and impatient. "Take this and go sell them. And don't you dare come back without selling everything," she barked, thrusting the tray into Susan's small hands. "If you think last night's beating was bad, try me today." "Yes, Auntie," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. She adjusted the tray on her head and walked out into the morning sun. The weight of the banana was nothing compared to the weight in her heart. As she wandered through the dusty streets of the village, she called out weakly, "Banana for sale, sweet ones." But the villagers passed her by without a second glance. She tried harder, raising her voice, but it still didn't help. The day dragged on, and not a single banana was sold. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, beating down mercilessly. Susan's throat was dry, and her stomach growled with hunger. She found a shady spot under a tree and set the tray down, tears welling up in her eyes. "What am I going to do?" she whispered to herself. She knew Aunt Janet wouldn't listen to excuses. She would beat her again, maybe even harder this time. As the fear of going home without selling the bananas consumed her, Susan thought of her mother. She needed her. Her warmth, her love, her kind words that always made her feel better. But she was all alone. Unable to hold back her tears any longer, Susan picked up the tray and started walking toward the cemetery. She didn't know why, but being near her mother's grave always gave her a small sense of comfort, as if her mother was still watching over her. When she reached the grave, she knelt down and placed the tray beside her. The sight of the unmarked mound of earth brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I tried, but no one bought any banana today. Aunt Janet is going to beat me again. I don't know what to do." Her small body shook as she sobbed, her hands clutching the dry earth. "I miss you so much, Mama. Why did you and Papa leave me? I don't have anyone anymore. I don't want to stay with Aunt Janet. She doesn't love me. She hurts me." Susan lay down on the ground, curling up beside the grave. The cool earth felt soothing against her burning skin. As she closed her eyes, she whispered, "Mama, please help me. I'm so tired. I just want to be with you." The exhaustion from the day overwhelmed her, and she soon drifted off to sleep. The world around her faded as she dreamed of better times, of her mother's laughter and her father's strong arms lifting her high into the air. In her dream, they were all together again, happy and safe. But when Susan woke up, the warmth of her dream was replaced by the harsh reality of the graveyard. The sun had dipped lower in the sky. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and turned to pick up her tray. What she saw made her freeze. The oranges were gone. Her heart raced as she stared at the empty tray. "No, no, no," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. "Where are they? Where did they go?" She looked around frantically, but there was no sign of the bananas anywhere. Then something else caught her eye. A small bundle of crumpled Naira notes, sitting neatly in the tray. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She counted the money and realized it was the exact amount she would have made if she had sold all the bananas. Susan's mind raced. Who could have done this? Who would take the bananas but leave the money? The graveyard was silent. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. The air felt strange, almost heavy, as if something beyond her understanding had just happened. She turned back to her mother's grave, her heart pounding. "Mama," she whispered, her voice shaking, "was this you?" A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the grave. She didn't know what to think or feel. Part of her was terrified, but another part of her felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if her mother was still looking out for her, even from beyond. Susan sat there for a long time, clutching the money in her hands. Tears streamed down her face, as a mixture of gratitude and confusion filled her heart. "Thank you, Mama," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Thank you." But the relief was short-lived. She knew she had to go back home. Aunt Janet wouldn't believe her if she told her what had happened. She would accuse her of stealing the money or lying about selling the oranges. Susan didn't know how she would face her. As the sun dipped lower, Susan stood up and wiped her tears. She placed the money carefully in her pocket and picked up the empty tray. Her legs felt heavy as she began the walk back home, her mind replaying the strange events over and over. When she reached the house, she paused outside the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of Aunt Janet's voice inside made her stomach churn with fear. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Susan!" Aunt Janet's sharp voice greeted her immediately. "You're late again. Did you sell everything?" Susan nodded quickly, holding out the money. "Yes, Auntie, I sold everything," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Aunt Janet snatched the money from her hand and counted it, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the notes. "At least you didn't come back empty-handed this time," she muttered. "Now go and clean the kitchen. You're useless for anything else." "Yes, Auntie," Susan replied, relief washing over her. For once, she didn't beat her. but her mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened at the graveyard. As she scrubbed the kitchen floor that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. She didn't know how or why, but deep down, she felt that her mother had somehow answered her cries for help. And for the first time in a long time, Susan felt a tiny spark of hope in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The next morning, Susan woke up feeling weaker than usual. Her stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that she hadn't had a proper meal in days. She struggled to get up from the hard floor, her body aching from exhaustion. The beatings, the hunger, and the fear. It was all too much for her small frame to bear. "Susan, come here!" Aunt Janet's sharp voice cut through the stillness of the house. She shuffled to her side, her feet dragging across the floor. Aunt Janet stood with her usual scowl, holding the tray of bananas. "Take this and go sell. If you don't come back with money today, you will see what I will do to you," she warned, her eyes narrowing. "You're just a useless girl." Susan didn't reply. She didn't have the strength to argue or even nod. She took the tray and balanced it on her head, her knees trembling under its weight. Without another word, she stepped out into the bright morning sun. As she walked through the village, calling out weakly, "Sweet ones for sale!" her voice barely carried. She felt invisible, as if no one cared whether she existed or not. Her feet dragged along the dusty road, each step more difficult than the last. She hadn't eaten, and the hunger clawed at her like a wild animal. By midday, she couldn't go on. She set the tray down by the side of the road and sat on a small rock, her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. The world around her seemed so big and uncaring, and she felt so small and helpless. "Can't do this anymore," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at the sky. Susan decided to go back to the one place that gave her some comfort: her mother's grave. She picked up the tray and slowly made her way to the cemetery. Her legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but she kept walking. When she reached the grave, she placed the tray beside her and knelt on the ground. "Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. Aunt Janet didn't give me anything to eat. I can't even sell these bananas because I don't have the strength. I wish you were here, Mama. I wish you could help me." Her shoulders shook as she cried, her small hands clutching the earth again. The hunger and sadness overwhelmed her, and before long she lay down on the cool ground, curling up beside the grave. The breeze blew the leaves of the nearby trees, and she closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion take over. When Susan woke up, she sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and turned to look at the tray beside her. Her heart skipped a beat. The oranges were gone again. Her tray, which had been full when she arrived, was now empty, just like the day before. A small bundle of crumpled Naira notes sat neatly in the tray. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, counting the money. It was the exact amount she would have made if she had sold all the oranges. But this time, there was something else. Beside the grave, on a flat rock, sat a plate of steaming jollof rice with a large piece of fried fish. The aroma filled the air, making Susan's mouth water instantly. Her stomach growled loudly, and her eyes widened in shock. She looked around, her heart racing. There was no one in sight. The cemetery was silent, except for the faint sound of leaves in the breeze. She turned back to the plate, her mind racing with questions. Who put this here?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Mama, was it you?" The sight of the food filled her with both fear and wonder. She didn't understand how it was possible, but her hunger was stronger than her confusion. She reached out with trembling hands and picked up the plate. The rice was hot, perfectly cooked, with a rich, savory aroma of spices and tomatoes. Susan hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the graveyard. But there was no one, just her, the plate of food, and her mother's grave. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Mama," and began to eat. The first bite filled her mouth with a burst of flavor, and she couldn't stop the tears that rolled down her cheeks. It had been so long since she had tasted something so delicious, so satisfying. Each bite felt like a gift, a small moment of comfort in the middle of her pain. As she ate, she felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain. It was as if her mother was there with her, watching over her, making sure she was okay. The fear she had felt moments ago faded, replaced by a strange sense of peace. When she finished the food, she placed the empty plate back on the rock and sat quietly for a while. The sky was beginning to darken, and she knew she had to go home, but a part of her didn't want to leave. Sitting by her mother's grave, she felt safe, loved, feelings she hadn't felt in so long. Finally, she stood up and picked up the tray with the money inside. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered again, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how, but I know you're helping me. I love you." As she walked back home, her mind was filled with questions. Who was leaving the money and the food? Was it really her mother's spirit? Or was someone secretly watching over her? The thought both comforted and scared her. She didn't know what to believe. But one thing was certain, something extraordinary was happening, and it was keeping her alive. When Susan reached home, Aunt Janet was waiting for her with her arms crossed, her face stern as usual. "You're late again," she snapped. "Where's the money?" Susan quickly handed her the Naira notes. Aunt Janet snatched them from her hand and began counting. After a moment, she nodded in satisfaction. "At least you did something right today," she muttered. "Now go and clean the kitchen before you sleep." "Yes, Auntie," Susan replied softly. Her heart was heavy, but her stomach was full for the first time in days. As she scrubbed the floors that evening, her thoughts returned to the graveyard, the missing oranges, the bundle of money, and the steaming plate of food. She couldn't make sense of it. She didn't have any answers, but deep down she felt certain that her mother was still with her, watching over her in ways she couldn't understand. Susan sat in the corner of the tiny living room, clutching her knees to her chest. Her stomach growled loudly, and she pressed her hand against it, hoping to silence the noise. Her head felt heavy, her body weak from days without proper food. "Auntie, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can I have something to eat?" Aunt Janet didn't even look at her. She sat on her stool, peeling yam, her movements sharp. "There's no food for you," she snapped. "You think food falls from the sky? A lazy girl like you should go and fend for herself." Susan bit her lip to stop the tears from falling. Her chest heaved with suppressed sobs, but she didn't dare cry out loud. She had learned the hard way that crying only made things worse with Aunt Janet. The sun set slowly outside, and darkness crept into the small house. Susan hadn't gone out to sell wares that day. When Aunt Janet handed her the tray that morning, she had collapsed to the floor, too weak to stand. Aunt Janet had shouted at her, called her useless, and then left her alone in the house while she went to the market. Now, as the silence of the night closed in, Susan's hunger became unbearable. Her small body shook as the tears she had been holding back burst forth. She cried quietly at first, the sound of her sobs barely audible. But as the pain in her stomach grew sharper, her cries became louder. "Keep quiet," Aunt Janet barked from her room. "Stop making noise or I will come out there and deal with you." But Susan couldn't stop. The hunger, the sadness, the loneliness, it was all too much for her to bear. She cried harder, her voice echoing through the small house. Aunt Janet stormed out of her room, her face twisted with anger. "You this girl! You won't let me sleep, eh?" she yelled. She grabbed Susan roughly by the arm and dragged her toward the door. If you want to cry so much, go outside and cry. I don't have time for your nonsense." Susan struggled weakly against her grip, but she was no match for Aunt Janet's strength. She shoved her out of the house and slammed the door behind her. The cool night air hit Susan's face. I mean the weather. She stood there for a moment, shivering and sobbing. She didn't know where to go at that time or what to do. Her bare feet felt cold against the hard ground. Then, as if by instinct, her legs began to move. She walked slowly, her small frame trembling with every step, until she found herself on the familiar path to the cemetery. The moon hung high in the sky. The sight of her mother's grave brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She stumbled toward the unmarked mound of earth and collapsed beside it, clutching the dry soil with her small hands. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stay there anymore. Aunt Janet doesn't want me. She doesn't love me. I'm so hungry, Mama. I don't know what to do." To Susan, it felt like her mother's spirit was there, comforting her, telling her she wasn't alone. She lay down on the ground, curling up beside the grave, and let her tears flow freely. "I'm not going back, Mama," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'd rather stay here with you. I don't want to go home." Did you enjoy this story? What stood out to you? Did you learn anything? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our next video. Thank you for watching.